Hello, welcome to the video. So if you're new around here, you might not know that I've been working on and off for a very long time on a video where I explore different Canadian animation, but despite the fact that I still plan to do that video and cover just, I don't know, close to 10 or 12 different pieces of Canadian animation, in the meantime, I wanted to share with you one of the animators that I found through researching for that video, and in my opinion, his work and the work that he inspired is definitely interesting enough, more than interesting enough to warrant its own video. And for some reason, I haven't seen a lot of discussion about this animator online, especially in terms of the YouTube animation community. Maybe there is, I just haven't found it yet, but I certainly hadn't come across any of his stuff until I started doing this research. And in fact, a Redditor who was giving me some advice on what to research and some major figures in Canadian animation pointed me to a book called Cartoon Capers by Karen Mazurkowicz, something along those lines. And it goes into a fair amount of detail about Mr. Norman McLaren, and from there it was just a complete rabbit hole of finding his stuff on YouTube, especially the NFB, we'll talk about them in a bit, have done an excellent job of providing just full short films. It's actually a really good YouTube channel. Anyway, I want to tell you about Norman McLaren. My goodness. After looking into this guy's work, and even after just seeing one of his most famous shorts, I was just floored by, for one thing, how forward thinking it felt and how modern it felt, despite the fact that this work is not contemporary. It's from the 40s and 50s and a little bit into the 60s. But what I'd like to do here today is give you just a bit of the story of Norm McLaren's life, and then I want to touch on 3 different short films of his that happen to reach me in some way and that I think you'll be into as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so Norman McLaren, he was born in Scotland, and he studied at, I believe, the Glasgow School of Art, so he was in Scotland for quite a while, just working on experimental stuff, and this will become very important soon enough. When he was starting out, just like as a kid, and he wanted to mess around with animation, he didn't have access to a camera. Typically, you would draw all your cells and then capture them on a camera, but in this case, he didn't have one, so instead, he would just draw directly on the film, and that was it. That was how he did it, but he went to the art school, did quite well. From there, he apparently spent some time at the UK General Post Office Film Unit, which I have never heard of before, but worked as cameraman guy, and I guess he worked there for about 3 years, 36 to 39. Had a very short stint in New York City, and then he wound up at the NFB. So, if you're not from Canada, and like me, you weren't super familiar with the NFB, it's the National Film Board of Canada, and today they promote tons of Canadian films. I've seen them promote just tons of really small-scale projects, a lot of independent projects. They seem to offer some resources as well. I am only familiar with their activity on like social media, and then through this research, a little bit aware of their history. And this is maybe one of the most interesting things about the NFB and sort of its transformation, is that it originally started out in the 30s, I believe, 30s or very early 40s, with the sole purpose of creating propaganda films, or at least that's my understanding of it. It was World War II, obviously trying to support the Allied efforts in the war. So it was, okay, you know, we need our typical stuff of like, oh, war bonds, those are good, save resources, things like that. And apparently, Norm McLaren was asked to join the NFB and sort of lead their film efforts, I guess. I think it was specifically just the animation section of the NFB he was supposed to head up, and the goal was really just make propaganda films, you know. And this is where it gets really interesting, because McLaren had this strong motivation to just make really interesting films. He doesn't seem to have been all that excited or enthused about the propaganda component. So what he did, not necessarily instead, but he would just sort of have the minimum required amount of the propaganda messaging in there somewhere, and outside of that, the film was its own thing. This is certainly the case with Hen Hop, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, because the film is technically supposed to promote the sale of war bonds, but as we'll see in the clips later on, I don't know if it really tried all that hard to actually do any of that. So basically what we have here is a situation where an extremely creative animator, who even from his childhood was sort of almost just out of necessity, trying very innovative techniques, has a ton of different ideas. He's formally educated in everything, but now he has the resources and the studio space and everything to just make movies. As I already touched on, he was more just interested in trying to do interesting things. Apparently the workload was eventually too much for him, so he was encouraged to build an entire animation team. Fascinating in itself. I'll talk about some of the notable people that he sort of got going in their careers towards the end of the video, but he had this giant machine going, basically. He had this incredible creative drive, and as we'll see when we talk about some of these specific films, just no limits, really. But I think that's enough of a bio for now. He's mostly known for his work at the NFB, extremely creative, and just these methods that I have not even heard of anyone else trying to this day. I'm sure maybe a handful of other people have, but my goodness, just the ideas this guy was executing are really fantastic. So let's start out with one of his most famous short films, probably the most famous short film he ever made. It's called Neighbors, with that European spelling, of course. There you go, Canada. And this is a hybrid live action and stop motion film. As I said, it's probably the one that McLaren is most well known for. It in fact won the Academy Award for animated short film the year of release. I think this was 52. Yes, it was. And as you'll see here, we have our two sort of lead actor guys, and it's a very basic premise. Of course, it's very clear what's going on. It's just the conflict of like one-upsmanship in a way, or just competition in general. It's ideology. It's obviously serving as a sort of metaphor for war in general and ideological differences. And especially what, like 52, okay, so what, 7 years after the, let's say, eventful tail end of World War II, now you have this guy coming out here. I think even the titles are in like all different languages, right? And it's very much a strong, obvious message of just like cooperation and hey, what is the point? Basic anti-war messaging, but even, I mean, for the early 50s, we wouldn't really see a lot of that sentiment manifest among the general public, younger people especially, until the 60s, I would argue. Certainly here in the States, I don't know that much about 20th century Canadian history. But as for the film itself, I watched this for the first time, having no idea when it was made. I had never heard of Norm McLaren. I didn't know what it was. And I just watched through, and immediately for some reason, and I think part of it is the soundtrack, which sounds to me like early computer music, and I have another guess at how it might have been made that I'll talk about in just a second. But for some reason, this struck me as something made in the 1980s. Does that make sense to anyone else besides me? I guess in some way it reminded me of like sort of the Talking Heads aesthetic, or like I could potentially see an Oingo Boingo music video looking a lot like this, or like covering similar subject matter in some form. It just still comes across as very hip. I don't know, maybe it's the way that the two lead actors look, or aspects of the performance, but no, early 50s, and just on the level of like execution and technical prowess, the idea of trying to tackle this film in the first place, like actually making it, kind of just makes my head spin. Like stop motion in general is such a huge time investment, and making it look good is no small feat. Also, this looks like everything's being shot outdoors, so that means you have a limited amount of time where the light is exactly how you want it, and then you have human actors. At moments they're being moved via stop motion, so now there's that extra challenge of, okay guys, really don't move, now move a little bit, now really don't move again. That probably lasted quite a long time. And I also think it was smart to sort of intersperse the stop motion stuff with just regular movement, because then 100% of the runtime doesn't have to be made up of that stop motion work. Probably would have inflated the sort of production timeline by a massive amount. The other tiny interesting detail to talk about with this one, so as I mentioned earlier, this was nominated for an Academy Award, and it won the Academy Award. However, the version that won had a little bit cut out of it, more or less for censorship, and I forget who made that decision exactly. I don't know if it was the Academy requesting that. I have a feeling the NFB, the heads of the NFB, made that call before it was submitted to the Oscars. Either way, it did not have the bit where the two men murder each other's wives. Guess they just figured, hey, that's a bit too violent, or maybe they thought it wouldn't win if it had that kind of violent scene left in. Either way, it's better with that bit in. I mean, for one reason, just because that was the intention of the artist here. That was part of the film. It's the climax to the conflict. It is a blunt, short film. However, I do think the messaging is successful. I think the execution is incredibly impressive. And this was yet another project, or yet another instance where it was clear that others at the NFB, specifically the folks in charge of the NFB, were not super keen on McLaren's, let's say, heavier work, stuff that dealt with heavier subject matter. And in fact, there's this fantastic quote from Mr. Grierson. Mr. Grierson is essentially responsible for starting Norm McLaren's career. He's the one who got him to New York to work with the Guggenheim Foundation, and then he's also the one who requested him to come up to the NFB. He was not a fan of Neighbors and the political messaging, the political content here. And so here's what he said of the film at some point. "I wouldn't trust Norman around the corner as a political thinker. I wouldn't trust Norman around the corner as a philosophic thinker. That's not what Norman is for. Norman is for Hen Hop. Oh, Hen Hop, that's wonderful. And so many other things. That's his basic gift. He's got joy in his movement. He's got loveliness in his movement. He's got fancy in his changes. That's enough." Oh, it's wonderful, isn't it? It makes the whole situation even more fascinating, is that not only was McLaren sort of taking advantage of, you know, his position with the NFB, it's just like, I just want to make weird stuff regardless of what you guys really want me to be doing. But the fact that, like, the founder of the NFB just didn't get it. But apparently he kept McLaren on, which I respect a great deal. That's massive. And obviously he does appreciate McLaren's animation just at the sort of immediate visual level, the level of style. And another reason I have a great deal of respect for John Grierson is that I don't know exactly what time period this second quote is from, but it really does signal the idea that, okay, at the very least, he recognized that McLaren was a really innovative and creative artist, and that there's value to that, even if it might not be serving all the practical needs or the practical desires of an organization like this in the moment. It takes a long, imaginative policy of national public relations to see the social justification for McLaren and experimental films of that kind. The justification is easy because it means that Canada can hold up her face in the art world abroad, and a distinguished face. That's pretty darn good. I just think that's the coolest thing, but that basically wraps up our little section on Neighbors here. So we're gonna move on to, well, the short film that Grierson was referencing in that first quote, Hen Hop. By the way, all of the films that I'm going to be talking about today here in the video can be found just in full on YouTube, because the NFB is just cool like that, I suppose. So Hen Hop specifically, I think I said this already, but yeah, it was meant to promote the sale of war bonds, trying to get people to contribute financially to the war effort. Watching the thing, it's just wonderful. You get no sense of weight in this one as compared to Neighbors. This is also a lot earlier. I think it was early 40s. Yes, 1942. So this is a full 10 years prior to Neighbors, in the midst of World War II. And I think maybe a lot of the justification with this one on all fronts from everybody in the NFB sort of connected to this one is just that, okay, we're going to raise morale. This is just a delightful little cartoon, and that's all it needs to be. At the end, you have your messaging, oh yeah, help us out. But it's really just incredibly simple, no voiceover, and you get this just kind of crazy animation that is nonetheless just delightful. Now, as I alluded to at the top of the video, this film and a bunch of other of McLaren's work used this technique that didn't involve a camera. Like I said, when he was a kid, he just experimented by drawing directly on the film. That's how Hen Hop was made. He's just drawing right onto 35mm film stock, and that's how the whole thing is accomplished. I think that's, I don't know, has anyone else heard of that? The only other approach, I guess, or technique that I can think of that involves drawing or painting painting directly on film stock would be like rotoscope, but in that case, you're drawing over existing live action footage. But this is it. Like, this is all we get, and I think it's a really great visual style. Even just the lines kind of make you question, like, it doesn't look like the early Disney stuff or the early Fleischer work. It almost looks like, I don't know, like it's being drawn on glass or something, and then you just have these flat colors in the background. It's really something. It's really something. And another thing that I want to touch on here is that there's this another video I found. I forget who made this. Maybe it was the NFB as well. But it's essentially a mini documentary about Norm McLaren's work and this technique of drawing directly on film. I'll show some clips here. And on top of just doing his animation work directly on the film, he would also sometimes create the soundtrack by drawing on the soundtrack. Okay, so real quick on film stock, the soundtrack is a physical space on the film, usually to the side. So that's where the sound, the waveform, I suppose, is supposed to be printed. But if you just if you just make marks on it, then when it gets run through a projector, for example, it translates those images or those marks into sound. And so McLaren would even create different types of sounds by using different types of visuals, like a dotted line, a full line with no gaps, etc. Come on. Come on. That's gotta be one of the coolest things I've heard of in animation for a long time, for a very long time. And in fact, it kind of shocks me. I don't have exact years for when he started doing that with the sound bit specifically, but I do know that is quite similar to some of the tape manipulation kind of stuff that was happening at like the San Francisco Tape Music Center with like Terry Riley and Pauline Oliveros and all those incredible people. I don't know, guys. This is it continues to blow my mind, and the idea that these incredible approaches and techniques got distilled into films like Hen Hop that are ultimately just plain entertaining. That's 100% my thing. Just really accessible experimentation, crazy ideas that boil down into something that's just fun to engage with. But okay, I think that's it for Hen Hop. We're moving on to the final one. This one, I don't know, maybe some people would have an issue with me calling this animation, and maybe it's not. I guess it really depends on our definitions. But this is just called opening speech, or opening speech McLaren. I assume it was supposed to run in a movie theater in front of something else. This is just kind of great. I guess it boils down to like physical comedy. So he's trying to make his speech. Oh, it's a serious speech. He's all dressed up in his nice suit. But then the microphone just literally keeps messing with him, or straight up runs away. And they do all these wonderful prop gags with the microphone like growing or animating it. It never really looks like stop motion. So I guess it's just effects. Maybe they have it on strings. I don't see the effects happening. I don't see the bones here. But it ends up just being this crazy physical comedy piece that goes on for quite a while. It's like just over 7 minutes long. I think it's fantastic, specifically because we say animation, we tend to think of, oh, drawing stitched together, looks like something's moving. We don't tend to think of the other forms. Okay, sure, there's claymation or just other forms of stop motion animation. Yeah, you got your 3D animation. But this is kind of like applying animation concepts to live action film in a completely different way, taking animation beyond those norms. And I think that's just absolutely fascinating. Okay, so those are the three specific short films that I wanted to talk about. And then to close out here, I really just want to touch on sort of how I see McLaren's legacy. I mentioned that I haven't seen much discussion on him online in particular, but people are certainly aware of his stuff. Specifically, I think Neighbors tends to be brought up in a lot of film classes or animation classes. Just from looking around online, that seems pretty evident. So it's not like he's some obscure guy that no one's ever heard of, but at least from my perspective, I don't know, he was able to build this incredible legacy of both creativity, just unhinged creativity, and also this sense of fostering art education, because as it turns out, he was actually working with UNESCO for, I think it says during the 50s and 60s. He was helping to support film and animation programs in China and India around that time. And even just the idea of him establishing this animation studio within the NFB, when he initially gathered up his little team of art school students, many of them went on to have incredible careers as famous animators or just do really famous work with the NFB. For example, a gentleman named René Jourdan Leon, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that name, went on to found the French language animation studio within the NFB. You had George Dunning. It turns out he animated and directed Yellow Submarine, of all things, so no big deal, just one of the most famous and well-regarded animation classics of the 20th century. And another guy who was on the team was Grant Munro, who's perhaps one of the most famous to come out of this animation studio, just a very famous animator and actor in his own right. And going back to just his insane dedication to creativity and his openness to new ideas, I wanted to tell you one final story, and this is another story that I got from Cartoon Capers. But let me set it up. So basically, this was around the time when McLaren was recruiting more art school kids to work at the NFB. There was this one fella, his name was, it was Grant Munro, in fact. It was the guy we were just talking about. So apparently he wasn't super excited about going in for this interview. He was like, I don't really want to do this. Whatever, I'll go. So apparently, Munro, he shows up to the meeting, and McLaren says, okay, hey, we had this guy who would do the titles. Those had to be hand-produced because this was the olden days. He was having some eye problems, this guy who was handling the titles, so they need someone else. And Munro's up for the job, basically. Recounting the story, Munro says that basically he was really a little bit rude and saying to McLaren, you got the wrong guy. I'm sorry, I don't really need this job. And specifically that he hated lettering. And Munro notes that, like, if he had said that to a bunch of other people, they probably would have just told him to get right out. But instead, McLaren just had this attitude of, okay, well, you don't have to do it in the typical way. Like, you don't have to just do standard lettering. And he said, you can use pipe cleaners if you want, or plasticine. And then this is the real kicker. Munro was like kind of taking it sarcastically, and he was like, oh, you mean, or I could even just use salt? And McLaren's like, yeah, sure. There was no hesitation to open up an avenue to a completely different method, to something that would end up creating a piece of film that just looked and felt completely different. And I see that in the work so thoroughly. It's not like this was a guy who just talked a big game, had these great ideas, and didn't end up executing them. No, he found his freedom basically everywhere. He didn't push so hard that he got kicked out of the NFB or anything like that, but during his time there, would manage to create some incredibly unique pieces of animation. As I was wondering aloud earlier, I don't know, have any of you guys heard of people doing this stuff? Have you heard of people drawn directly on film earlier than he was? Have you heard of creating a soundtrack by drawing on his work is just absolutely fascinating to me. And yes, of course, I was planning on talking about him in the video on Canadian animation, but as it turned out, I was dedicating like 20 to 30 minutes to his work, and it was just way too much. It was going to be pretty lopsided. So I hope that this has been a decent way to share just some of his films with you. Like I said, all the ones that I've mentioned here are available in full on YouTube right now, so you can go ahead and watch those. There are many more of his films online. Just fascinating. And if you want to get some more stories about McLaren and a bunch of other famous Canadian animators, Cartoon Capers is pretty great. As for the full video on Canadian animation, yes, I'm hoping soon, but it'll be much more rapid fire kind of stuff. So I really do think it was worth it taking the time to talk about Norm McLaren's work. I hope you've enjoyed it. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.